Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Solid Verbal. I am doing this introduction, me, Dan, not Ty, because Ty is busy at the moment dealing with some family stuff. Thankfully, everybody's okay. But just, Ty's a human. He has to deal with some stuff and look after some stuff. So I am joined today by A-list, Hall of Fame, Mount Rushmore, Solid Verbal guest from The Athletic / New York Times / Fox Sports / the Audible podcast with Stu Mandel, Bruce Feldman. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm hoping everything's good on Ty's end.
It is.
Yeah, and so it's awesome to be on with you. And I feel like a special connection now that I've actually had the food you serve. Yes,
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm a more three-dimensional
human.
I
thought it was going to be.
You went into that dinner with mediocre expectations.
No, I went into it thinking it would be good, but and I'm not just, blowing smoke at you, but the best croutons I've ever had in my life.
Wow.
Arguably the best pizza I've ever had in my life. I could not get over how a skinny guy can make such good food.
I appreciate that. It's come a long ways. It's a good meal, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. Here's my question for you. Is it slow off-season wise? Is it different in that you're both covering games and covering, news items and coaching hires, just because you've been in the mix with so many big coaching hires and changes behind the scenes? And this year it was like Purdue, North Carolina, UCF. It didn't feel as major.
Those were the big ones. Those were the bigger ones.
Yeah. Right. But everything else feels chaotic and exploding around it, just not the hires, if that makes sense.
Right. So I think it's an interesting shift. The beat is certainly not like the NFL. And what I mean by that is there's some transactional news, but ultimately it's like, and I'm not to diminish it, but at least from the Fox side of my job, 80% of that stuff is not rising up to the level that my bosses are going to care that much about,
Right.
And whereas, and even at The Athletic now, I think there's times where I'll say, hey, I'm hearing such and such. And there's stories that they're stories that they wouldn't want stories on. I mean, I could tweet out the news of those things, but I don't think that there are things that would end up, hey, we're going to go to the trouble to have an editor work this story up and post it. That's not, I think, part of it. Now, there's certain things like we're taping this Monday morning, and yesterday, early afternoon, I'm about to take my son to his basketball game. And I got a tip about Notre Dame, who they were targeting their defensive coordinator, Chris Ash. And so I started making calls, and because it's Notre Dame. It's obviously a big job. It's a recognizable name. And so, reached out to my colleague on the Notre Dame beat for The Athletic, Pete Sampson, who does a terrific job. And he was able to go further on that. And then I'm literally on the bleachers of the game. And he was like, I said, hey, whatever you can, if you feel like where it's buttoned up or where, beyond that, then just let me know and I'll just retweet whatever you tweeted out kind of thing. But so you're trying to have, as you know, as a father with 2 kids, young kids, you're trying to have some sense of a real work-life balance, especially now. Because to be honest, there's a lot of stuff down the rabbit hole of, a bunch of us were at the national title game in Atlanta last week. And, I have really good colleagues at The Athletic. Ralph Russo has been a tremendous addition for us. And he's done a really good job covering the sport. But we had Ralph, we had Chris Finney. We don't need to have 4 people at a meeting where we know going in there's probably very little chance anything is going to happen about the CFP getting tweaked this year,
right?
As opposed to next year. So I think what you have to do for your own sanity's sake is pick your spots. I mean, if you chase every cat and every rabbit that's out there and every squirrel, I think you're just going to be like a zombie. And some of the stuff that I would pursue before, I probably won't now, just because my kids are 10 years old and I want to, I don't want to have a lot of regrets about that. But the stuff, I mean, not to get too long winded, but the stuff that to me is the most important things I can do to serve the reader or the consumer of the audiences of I work for, is to talk to coaches and know what's going on, why things have happened and different things. For me, the best story I could do for the Athletic around the national title game was to try to get the story of Ryan Day's family, what the last 50 days had been like from the Michigan game to the national title game. That was what I was really trying to get at, and I was happy with, thankful that they opened up to me the way Ryan Day's wife and Ryan Day's son RJ did. But like, I feel like you just have to pick your spots, and you have to know what best serves the audience.
Let's go further there, because that was obviously a story that got a lot of conversation going about what it's like to be Ryan Day, what it has been like to be Ryan Day, not just in the past 15 days, but overall in his time in Columbus. Obviously, the unique circumstance of both losing to Michigan for 4 years in a row and winning the national championship, and having his job and his life come under scrutiny even more so. You followed coaches. You've covered coaches for a long time in various fishbowls around the country. Did the depths of what they went through surprise you? Was it just a more pronounced version of what other coaches and families have gone through? To what degree was that unique, that sort of experience?
I thought this was unique. Going back certain parts of it, I can remember Bill Curry, just such a decent man who had been the Alabama coach around 1990, was a really good college coach. Then he's a Georgia Tech guy, had seen everything, played for Vince Lombardi and the NFL, the heyday. And so he told me some stories about getting a brick thrown through his window because they couldn't beat Auburn.
Right.
They couldn't beat Auburn, and it was crazy. But that was a different time in terms of like, people are way more connected and way more exposed in terms of social media.
Yeah.
It's not hard to get somebody's cell phone. We know that happened with Nina Day, Ryan's wife. It's not hard to know where people live. And I think because we've seen so much crazy stuff happen in our society, I could see like when she told me about it, and I know from having some people really close to them, I knew some of the stuff they were dealing with. It escalated a lot, it seems like, after this particular loss to Michigan. It was the fourth one in a row. This was not a great Michigan team by any stretch. It happened at home. And so, knowing some of that going in, I think there's like Kirk Herbstreit, who knows, he's the voice of the sport, right?
Right.
He's been covering it for 30 plus years and has amazing access. And he's also from, remember, like Kirk moved from Columbus where he, his dad coached at Ohio State. Kirk played there, obviously the whole story. But then they moved to Nashville. And I remember Kirk has been pretty outspoken about like certain things. And he was in the, Ohio State, I think, blew out Tennessee. And then he's, late in the game, he's starting to kind of talk about some of that stuff.
Right.
And so when after they win the national title, like right after, one of the first people I see on the field is a guy named Stanley Spiro. And Stanley is Ryan Day's father-in-law. And he's known Ryan since he was like 9, but he's also like a legendary Division II basketball coach. He was at a school in New Hampshire, and he was up for the Basketball Hall of Fame a year ago. So like, he's had over 600 wins. That's Ryan Day's wife grew up in that household of the college basketball coach where they were great. But that stuff, like, as he was telling me, it was like, the challenges of becoming a coach's family often is like, the mom raises everything. The mom does all of it because the dad is either on the road recruiting or doing, especially, it's different to be a college football coach than it probably was a Division II basketball coach in that part of the country.
Sure.
But this is times 1,000 because now you got a hated rival. And, look, I work with Urban Meyer on the Big Noon show. I feel like it's almost every week he'll reference 7-0. It's like, it is such a big part of Ohio State's identity tied to Michigan that got ramped up in a way. I know it was bad for John Cooper, where 25 years ago,
right?
But it was way worse now. right? And so, I mean, Ryan Day's record now, he's 70-10. There's like one coach in major college football history who has a better winning percentage. That's Newt Rockne. I mean, Larry Kura's is a lower divisions coach who hadn't even, is a legend too. But like, just in terms of major college football right now, that's insane. And there were a lot of people thinking he should be fired if he doesn't win the playoff.
Right.
Now, from my perspective, knowing him, knowing his family, and knowing that, mental health has been a big, important issue to him because his father died by suicide when he was like 8 or 9 years old.
Right.
And so they've been very vocal and very proactive on that issue. I'm sitting there after the after the Michigan game, thinking, I'm still in Columbus, like, if they don't win the national title, and they're talented enough to certainly do it, but if they don't, I wonder if he's going to say, you know what, this isn't worth it for my family and me.
I was going to say,
be here, and I wrote something about that because just knowing how hard it was on them. Like RJ, his son, told me school was really rough. You had grown men basically, coming after him. They hired their own, security firm that around the clock. The grandfather stayed with them an extra 10 days. The grandfather, by the way, has been battling cancer. Jeez. He put off a procedure for prostate just so he could make sure he would be at the national title game. It's a pretty remarkable story behind the scenes of what's been going on. But to answer your question, this was way different than anything I've ever heard.
And it's already that job. A number of these jobs are already all encompassing, right? That you're recruiting all year long, you're monitoring portal stuff, you are dealing with your own roster, you're figuring out coaches coming in and out, you're expanding your recruiting department. There's a million different things that keep these guys up at nights. So if this is a unique situation for Ryan Day in terms of the blowback that he and his family received after losing to Michigan, there's almost no winning if you don't win a national championship every year. How long does a human have the stomach to coach at Ohio State if that is the reality?
That is a great question. I can never say if I was Ryan Day. I just can't get my head to go there. But, you have a guy who now, he coach, unlike, his predecessor, Urban Meyer, unlike Lou Holtz, unlike Steve Spurrier, like he'd been in the NFL. Like he knows what that world is like.
Right.
And better or worse. I think as a national championship winning coach, and he's a good offensive coach. Remember, like he was running it until he hired Chip to take over. But I think, and they were really good on offense. I think, he's different than. I'm not saying he's Harbaugh, because Harbaugh was with the Niners and took a mediocre team and got him to the Super Bowl like pretty fast. Mm-hmm. Right? Say what you want about that guy. That guy knows what he's doing as a coach. But I think the NFL teams are going to be really skittish on taking just a college guy, but this is not like, this is a guy now who's won a national title. This is a guy who's coached in the NFL. This is a guy who has a good understanding of offense. I think he has we saw this. He has a great connection with his players. I mean, a lot of guys stayed because they wanted to play together and play for him. I don't know how long you can sustain that. I don't know how long you want, and I'm not saying he's like, okay, I won my national title. I've proven it to myself. This was a special team. Like right now, it's not like there's, we're going into a different NFL hiring cycle. We obviously know that the Cowboys just made their hire and there's, most of I think the Saints is like, as we're taping this, the only thing that's open, right? So,
right.
But I don't know how long, if you're him, do you want to do this? And what's the next thing though? It's right. If you're going to be a head coach, is it go to the NFL? I mean, I would think it is, because it's like, it'd be hard to get a better job if you're a college coach in Ohio State. You're the most resourced program basically there. You recruit like you're an SEC school, but you're not in the SEC, and you have, you do have a lot of support. And I think that will be an interesting thing. How long does he want to stay in this situation?
What do you hear around the country, especially at those higher profile places, that like all of these guys are burning the candle at both ends? Dan Lanning, Steve Sarkisian, whoever, Billy Napier, anywhere in the country. The sport broke Nick Saban, who is unbreakable, the sport broke him because of the challenges of the portal and NIL, and he had just reached a breaking point. What do you hear about like the sustainability of being a major college football coach? The money's nice. That's why the money's there. But like, can you, if you're, and here's an example, like if you're Dan Lanning, can you spend the next 15 years of your life doing this and maintain sanity?
I don't know, but I think you can spend the next 5. And I think they have to really think in terms of that window. Like, I've gotten close to Chris Peterson. He's a brilliant guy. Work with him at Fox. He has become a huge resource for coaches. And coaches, some of them who aren't that old, who are like, they're like boiling inside about it. Not just coaches in college, also in the NFL. Like, I think burnout is a real thing. And I think the guys who sit there and go, I'm going to do this for 20 years are kidding themselves.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 years. Dan Lanning's a good one to bring up because Dan Lanning's still very young.
Right.
And he's like, I feel like he's in his sweet spot right now. Does that change 5 or 6 years from now? Like, I feel like this coaching is going to become like dog years now. Like, well, like the North Carolina folks and Bill Belichick can talk about like, yeah, it's going to be like an NFL model and everything. It's like, you can say that now because you've been on the job for like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Right. But like enough people I know who are actually been doing the job for a while are like, yeah, it's going to drive him mad.
Wait until he's in 7 high schools in New Jersey in like a 20-hour period.
Wait till he's just, like hounded by some player's aunt who's turned into the agent of the player. And that happens a lot. And it's just like, you're not dealing with CAA and these agents all the time. You're dealing with like guys who popped up out of nowhere who are now, trying to rep the players and everything else. And that can be exhausting. No matter what, you can have a personnel department all you want. I think like Nick Saban had all those things. And I think dealing with, I don't want to call it necessarily the entitlement, but just the change of how the athlete is wired now in this day and age. I think that became way, way different for him. And so he bailed out to go into TV. Now look, he's in his early 70s.
Yeah.
Dan Lanning is not. John Sumrall is not. Lane Kiffin is not. I think it's different when you're that age. Once you, I think, get over 55, I think things start to get a lot heavier, right? And I don't know what that range is. Because look, there's plenty of coaches. Kurt Signetti is whatever he is, 63. Lance Leipold is around that. There's really good coaches who are in their prime, in their early mid 60s. And it's not to say that the places they're at, and these are two examples, Kansas and Indiana, they're both obviously great basketball schools. I don't think the pressure to win is at the same level, certainly it is at Ohio State, where it's like unforgiving, like that level. You better, where 11-3 is a bad year, right? So I don't know. I think we're talking about 5-year windows now. We're not talking about, oh yeah, this guy's going to be one of the all-time greats 20 years from now.
One name we haven't mentioned, haven't brought up, somebody who has that same level of expectation. And I don't know how much I saw this like around, but I read John Talty and Armin Katayan's book. I think it's called The Price recently. And they mentioned Kirby Smart was positive he was retiring 3 years ago. I think 3 summers ago, 3 or 4, something like that, in the midst of Georgia building up this monster. Does he have 5 years left in him? I mean, running Georgia seems like 24/7, nothing but stresses, nothing but, again, burning the candle at both ends. He's not old, but he's definitely somebody who strikes me as somebody who could be like, you know what? I was this close before. I'm just fried. My kids aren't super old, and I'm just opting for a part 2 of my coaching life or my life in general.
Dan, I go to the NFL Combine every year, and I run into so many coaches I know who are former college coaches, and a lot of them made the move actually, like more than 3 years ago. They may not, I'm talking maybe they moved 5 years ago. It was still kind of nutty in terms of the calendar. but it wasn't like this where you have agents who are, were basically coming up to coaches like seemingly like every couple of weeks to be like to try to get a better deal or to try to, get somebody poached off their roster.
Right.
Like those things are different. And right now there is no off season for college coaches. You can say, oh yeah, we have a big personnel department. It's not, like the coaches are still involved in that. And the guys I know who went to the NFL, very few do I know look back and be like, yeah, I want to be involved in that.
Right.
Now, circumstance may have dictated that they ended up bouncing back because they were looking for a job. But I think the money is good. The money can be very good in college, obviously. I mean, look what, Jim Knowles is getting over $3 million a year to be a coordinator. And I think there's certainly a lot of coordinators who are now making seven figures. But in the NFL, and again, the NFL is like, it's hard to stay up there too, right? Because they have guys get fired after 1 year. You can go from hot to cold in a hurry, but the quality of life is way different, I think, for them. And that's a much more attractive destination. I think for Kirby Smart, you have a guy who won 2 national titles, felt like he should be close to, in the middle of it for a little bit. But I would be surprised if he's there for 10 more years. It's just seems like it's so much. He's a grinder and it's so much of a grind. Like, when does he sit there and think, like, okay, I want to try to, maybe I'm better served to be an NFL coach. I mean, again, everything I've heard is, Athens is a great place, to raise a family, and he's got relatively young family, as you said. So I don't know, that there's probably consideration to that. If I move to pick the team, if I move to become the Green Bay Packers head coach or the, or the Denver Broncos head coach, I'm uprooting my family. Is like, dad was a really successful high school coach in Georgia. I'm sure they're very comfortable in that part of the country. So there's only, I think there's a balance there too to that.
How has this sort of amorphous blob of like the money behind the scenes evolved in this new era? I just wonder, because we have not seen boosters programs willing to pay huge buyouts recently. I think aside from Jimbo, that like we've seen these deals, and maybe these types of deals with your 40, 50, 60, 70 million dollars guaranteed are going to dry up. But it seems like we're seeing less coaches fired, and maybe boosters are saying like, I'd rather spend money on Dylan Gabriel or Caleb Downs than put it into like firing this coach when we don't even trust you to hire a new guy. Have the winds shifted behind the scenes in terms of how money is viewed with coaches as it relates to portal, NIL, whatever?
That's a good question. So in November-ish, myself and a colleague of mine from The Athletic, Matt Baker, did a story about what the hell went wrong at Florida State this year.
Yeah.
And, so we had interviewed a ton of people, and it wasn't like a bash Mike Norvell session or anything like that. It was just like, what actually happened?
It was a very dramatic change. Yeah.
Yeah. And he did a terrific job. I think he's a really, really good coach, and he did a terrific job getting them to 13-0 before they got snubbed from the playoff. And then obviously it fell apart this year. But our editor said, you should try to talk to an AD or two to see, like, which is what you just said. We just saw the year before Texas A&M ate a massive amount of money to get rid of Jimbo Fisher. And so I talked to an AD at a big, big school, and this person was like, I think Texas A&M is really a one-off. I think there's really only like one, maybe. And he said, I think Texas could probably eat this contract. Like, in theory, a bunch of us could, we could eat $70 million. But it's like, after you get through it, you're like, whoa, like, that's not something that, like it's too much damage on the back end. It's almost like, maybe this is the wrong analogy, it probably is, but when I worked at CBS Sports Network, we had, this is like 15, 12 years ago, there was Hurricane Sandy came through, and we had a big fancy new studio by Chelsea Piers, and it just was like literally under like 12 feet of water.
Right.
And so I remember I asked somebody there, I'm like, are they going to rebuild it? And the person was like, they'll have the insurance will pay for it, but our insurance, like, you won't get that insured again. Like, it's like,
right.
you can get the money back, but you're not going to be, you can't do that again kind of thing. You won't be able to get that insured or whatever it was. And like the point of this is like right now, there's two examples of guys who I think are on a hot seat going into 2025. One is Brian Kelly. He's at a place where the last three head coaches won national titles.
Yep.
They had a Heisman winner and two high-level receivers, and they weren't great. They were good, but not. And this year they were not. They really struggled. Now they've loaded up in the portal. He's been vocal about them not, losing bidding wars or whatever you want to say. They should have a really loaded team. I mean, this is a team that at least should make the playoff. It's a 12-team playoff.
Sure.
And it's not like Alabama's there. Georgia's clearly taken a little bit of a step back. So, if they don't, I don't know how that fan base and that leadership, handles it. An example more close to what you grew up around is USC. Like, they made a splash hire to get Lincoln Riley here. And the old regime, pre-Jen Cohen, really stuck, got a really lopsided contract.
Yeah.
If it would have cost $92 million to try to part ways with Lincoln Riley this winter, like the USC didn't have that. I don't know what does, if they go 6-6 or 7-5, do money people who have not been, as far from best I can tell, been very engaged, to all of a sudden they go, okay, this is enough. We're going to get 78 or whatever it is to move on from Lincoln Riley. I don't know. But like, that's a program which, I mean, credit to them. They were able to keep Danton Lynn because I think he's excellent. I think he was really important for them. If they had lost him too, that would have been a gut punch. But I just don't feel like that's a program where you're like, at least LSU, you can sit there and go, like, I think that, I think Garrett Nussmeier is a legit Heisman candidate going into this year. And they have added a ton of speed in the portal and added some really good players. Like, okay, I think they're, the expectation should be there. If I'm watching USC right now and I'm a USC fan, I'm like, I don't know. It's hard for me to see better than 8-4 this year.
Yeah, and it's also, right, if you gave Jen Cohen truth serum and you said, do you want a coach that's half the cost of Lincoln Riley and take the $5 million and add it to the NIL pool every year? It actually seems like ADs might have more leverage than ever before. It seems like it's never been more difficult to take on a new huge job because the roster you're inheriting is going to be immediately picked apart. All the kids are going to leave for the portal and see what you're going to get. And that in stacked major conferences, as the Big 10, SEC, Big 12 has expanded, it's never been muddier at the top to come into a huge job and, within a year or two be incredible. And so I wonder if this is like, we talk about like, oh, the players have so much more power now. It almost seems like ADs have perhaps more power than they did in the modern era.
If you followed competence, like right now.
Exactly.
Like, I mean, like they walked in this specific example of like, a very largely incompetent regime that just wanted to make a splash and then just wasn't going to be around for when you threw the cinder block in the kiddie pool.
Right.
After that. So.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I wonder if the era of those types of buyouts that like Jimmy Sexton had it good for a long time, but it might be a little bit different now.
Don't kid yourself. Jimmy Sexton's always going to have a kid.
Fair.
Once he's around, it'll like there's enough tentacles of things and everything where, I think that group of high level agents are always going to still figure a way to be very, very engaged. I think it's the parts where, because also there's always going to be either desperation or incompetence in the leadership part of these college programs. And I'm talking usually about like administrative wise, whether it's a president who's clueless about college athletics or an AD who's in over their skis.
Fair. Did anything surprise you outside of the coaching carousel this offseason? Anything in the way of the portal? Did you hear any transfer stories that even for you who has heard it all, that like, oh, they tampered how? Oh, they contacted this person how? Was there anything, you don't have to name names, whatever you're comfortable with, but anything where you're just like, man, this is a different world?
One of the things that surprised me was the number, like, and again, Chip Brown, who's been on the Texas beat for a long time and does a really good job. He'd reported that Quinn Ewers had turned down, I think, $8 million.
Right.
Um, that number is staggering from this standpoint.
It's a year of $8 million.
Yeah, and he's a good quarterback, but he's also a quarterback who'd been injured. Like, he'd never had a whole season when he was at Texas. It was always a couple games he missed, and I'm just sitting there going, like, would Texas Tech be the school that would make that kind of like big, it's an incredible amount of money if that's what it was. Now, I think we have to keep, and I say this, and again, this isn't a reflection on Chip at all, because like I think he's a terrific reporter, but I think there's, what I've learned over the last few years is you got to take these numbers with a grain of salt. Like, about a year ago, we did a story at The Athletic where it was like a 3-part series. And I remember one of the best resources I had for this was when I talked to a quarterback who had transferred multiple times, but also, and it's a guy I knew, so I'd already had like a rapport with him for years. And he had been he'd been at a combine training center where there was other 10 other athletes there that after 3 months, they're pretty close. And so he had a lot of information. And I'm not saying that somebody couldn't have BS'd him or embellished the story or whatever, but he was explained a lot of things to me about how some of these things actually work that I don't think he brought a lot of stuff to light. And then you started like kind of back referencing it with the coaches. And I'm like, whoa, this is way different than the perception. Cause I feel like a lot of times it's very surfacey. Like, if you look on social media, this winter, you'll see a lot of, Johnny Smith is intends to go in the portal, says agent so-and-so,
Right.
And it's usually an agent who is like nobody had ever heard of till, 10 minutes ago. Right. And so it's people who are starting their business and trying to leverage the business. They're also trying to set a market, and so I think you take that stuff with a grain of salt. And so, it's just very interesting. Like, I had a conversation with a coach over Christmas, and then it eventually got into, we had one of our players who, and this coach was like almost incredulous that this guy became a real hot commodity in the portal. And so as we're talking, I Googled his name and I was like, whoa, this guy is way higher ranked than this guy is talking about. And he was like, just kind of, he knew him better than probably the coaches who recruited him, like this winter, because he coached him. And he was just like, it's just a really interesting,
that he's just a guy, right? That there wasn't anything particularly special.
He's a guy who has traits, but really couldn't be counted on in the field because there's a lot of stuff, because there's just so many mental mistakes and different things. And these were the shortcomings are that you probably wouldn't know unless you work with the person every day. And the point of it is, it's very murky in the portal space, right? So it's interesting, but you were asking me in the beginning about and I felt I was like, how are you chasing all these things left and right? Because there's so much stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the portal, I feel like it's like, you got to be, I get why it's news. And I mean, one of the guys who's, neck deep in it is our friend Max Olson, who's a great guy, good reporter and very smart. And it's just like, man, this could be dizzying when you get into it. Max and I used to have, when I worked with him at the Athletic last year, we'd have some interesting conversations, not arguments, but just interesting conversations about the stuff we'd heard from different sources about certain players. And, and certainly guys can flourish in different spots. I mean, look at the school that you went to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how many people outside of maybe 3 would have been like, oh yeah, Bo Nix is going to tear it up on the other side of the country and then go be a terrific young NFL quarterback, right? I mean, that can happen in the right system. I saw firsthand how amazing Joe Burrow was. Like he's the one guy I've seen in the last 10 years who's a quarterback. I'm like, oh yeah, I'd bet my money on him being an NFL star because I know what he was like and I know what the coaches thought of him. Yet, and again, this is no fault on Joe Burrow. I mean, he didn't, they picked Dwayne Haskins, who was a huge recruit, who ended up throwing for like 50 touchdowns.
Record-setting player,
It wasn't like, the guy they picked couldn't throw. But it's that thing it's the new version of recruiting. Like you and I both, I know you like recruiting more than you probably, it's more trouble than it's worth, but it's a fascination, right?
Sure.
And I definitely had that too. That's why I did Meat Market.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of us like that. I just think with the portal, because there's another layer of it, because it's the money part of it that takes it into like, ooh, this is murky. This is a little sleazy, but this is definitely interesting.
What changed at Michigan? I mean, obviously the losing changes people and gets people riled up. And, the stories about Larry Ellison's girlfriend or wife going to Michigan and him putting money into the program. And obviously Bryce Underwood was a huge thing. Like, how often does that happen where just like, oh, the right person has a fire lit under them. And now, the sort of calculus behind the scenes has changed immensely. And what do you know about Michigan?
Desperation changes things. Look, Ole Miss, like desperation and alignment are a dangerous combination. And so Oregon has it because Phil Knight, Phil Knight wants to win a national title before he's not with us anymore.
Yeah.
And so you have that.
I mean, same.
What's that?
Same for me. I'd like to Oregon to win a national title. I just don't have, a fraction less of the capital. Yeah.
But like Ole Miss, super ambitious, super aggressive. They ramped up their portal in a big way. Walker Jones, who was a former player back in the 90s, they're really good at that, and I think they've given Lane Kiffin more resources than Ole Miss has probably ever had. Certainly ever had, but when it comes to Michigan, it was a rough year. And I think there's some unique pieces of this, right? Like, I think the way Jim Harbaugh operated, and every year for the last 3 years, Jim Harbaugh danced with the NFL. It was not a surprise that Jim Harbaugh was going to leave after he won a national title. In fact, it would have been a real surprise if he stayed. But so because of that, I think few things happened. I think the collective was kind of like, how much is it factored in? From what I was told from people inside the Michigan program, Jim Harbaugh was not aggressively going after Bryce Underwood, who's obviously a local quarterback and super talented. It was like, hey, let the SEC fight over him.
Right.
And then after Harbaugh left to come out here to the West Coast to be an NFL coach, Michigan brought back Sean McGee, who was a Naval Academy guy and very smart. And he'd been in the NFL in the front office with the Bears. He came back. He's the GM. And I think from what I've heard, it was a big priority for him and for Sharon Moore. This guy's in our backyard. He grew up a Michigan fan. What are we doing here? And I think the alignment they had, and Michigan has real money people.
Yeah.
It's not just like Larry, whatever, like if it's Larry Ellison's wife, that's what I initially heard it was.
Yeah.
Like, obviously that's an insane amount of money they have access to, but it's not like Michigan has, you go into the Michigans, there are certain Big Ten schools that the pool is way deeper than you get at a lot of SEC schools where it may be, 3 big boosters who have money burning a hole in their pocket. But then if it doesn't work out, you get sideways with them. The roster on those people is not as deep. Now, Texas A&M, I know it's an SEC school, different story. Same thing with Texas because you have a lot of energy money.
Right.
But Michigan has that. And I think in this version of it, talking to people at Michigan, they're more confident about it in this model than they were in the back in the day of under the table money, because this is something that they feel like they're way better resourced than most of the SEC is to win a lot of these battles.
In that conference in the Big Ten, there's a school that is kind of the most confusing to me, but I also feel like might be sort of a victim of the modern era, and that's Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the homegrown guys in Wisconsin, Minnesota, nearby states. You're building out great lines. They've got NFL players all over the place. They hire a guy fresh off of the playoff in Cincinnati and Luke Fickell, and it just seems to have gone sideways. I mean, they've dealt with injuries, obviously, notably at quarterback, but even like Tyler Van Dyke never, I don't think, really struck the fear of God into the Wisconsin schedule. Is this sort of just like we kind of know how this is going to end, but it hasn't yet? Like, has this been a shock to you that Wisconsin, this like the most solid ground program in the country, you could, write them in for 8-9 wins a year minimum, is like, grasping at straw? They lose a cornerback to Miami, and there's this big like to do back and forth, and Xavier Lucas. Like, are they just not built for these times?
I think a couple things happened. Like, remember, there used to be East and West in the Big Ten pre the
Sure.
four old Pac-12 schools come in. So you were better positioned scheduling wise. I'm not saying that we're beating nobodies, but like they were as resourced as anybody on that side of it. It was like them and Iowa. Nebraska was spinning its wheels. You had Purdue, Illinois went through, like Bielema's gotten Illinois to be good. I mean, he's actually kind of done to some degree what it used to be, and Northwestern, just like Minnesota, it's like they're all kind of in the same
Totally
boat. And I think in the first year, it sounded like Wisconsin had some not great staff chemistry on the offensive side of the ball. Then you mentioned they get Tyler Van Dyke. Tyler Van Dyke got hurt in the game we were at early in the season against Alabama, a game I don't think they were going to win anyway, because they're just not as talented. And it just felt like they were struggling to find their identity. They had a stretch in mid-season where they won 3 in a row or 4 in a row. And you're talking to somebody on the staff there, they were like, Luke's very confident, and it started to reflect his temperament. Let's just be good at what we're good at. And I think, it felt like they were a low ceiling team, right? And I think they can still be like an 8-win team, but that's not like where they were before. It was like they were winning double digits very consistently. And I'm not saying they can't get back to that, because that guy got Cincinnati to a playoff. Like, he has a formula. He knows what it takes. Obviously, he, overturned his offensive staff. I don't know. Like, I thought this would have gone better than it has, but I can see why they are struggling. I can see why right now they're just in the pack, and Iowa feels like they're a step ahead of them. You have Minnesota, like, I know PJ Fleck, there's some people who don't like him. He's a good coach. Like,
yes.
I think we'll see what happens with like, some of those mid-tier schools, like a Michigan State. Obviously they weren't a West team, but like, Jonathan Smith, he did a really good job at a place that's even tougher to win, I think. We'll see what happens with Matt Rule. I was expecting them. They took certainly a step forward in his second year. I thought they would have taken a bigger step forward, but they've been aggressive in the portal, and they've really taken some big swings. And I wouldn't write them off. Like, if you ask me, and you didn't, but like, if I ask you this, like 2 years from now, who do you think is better, Nebraska or Wisconsin? My gut is going to be Nebraska.
Right. That makes sense. They seem to, even with the offensive struggles this year, the momentum is there, the defense is there, the hiring has been there. Like, the Tony White hires seem to have been very good, even though he has now moved on to Florida State. I think maybe the hire of the last couple of years, basically has been Curt Cignetti at Indiana, with what he did immediately. But even closer to you, and I'm more familiar with him as well, Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State has surpassed my expectations, given where that program was, given how much he needed to hit the portal, given, changing conferences, just the number of challenges. He gave an interview where he he didn't have to, he felt compelled to thank an individual booster, because if it weren't for him, Arizona State wouldn't exist, essentially. What have you heard behind the scenes about the job he's done? And do you expect, is there a ceiling for Arizona State, or do you expect this program to keep climbing?
I don't think there is a ceiling. Like, you talk to enough old people and they're like, yeah, that was always a sleeping giant.
Right.
There's a lot of talent. It's not Southern California, but there's still a lot of talent around there. And I think Kenny Dillingham obviously grew up there. He was a student there. He's been around good programs. He's smart. He has a ton of energy. I mean, our old colleague Ari Wasserman, who will say some outlandish stuff from time to time.
Yeah.
But I remember Ari, beating his chest about they got to hire Kenny Dillingham and wrote a column about it. I'm not saying Ari was the only one who said they should have done that,
No.
but like, just like the first year when they were held together with glue and Scadaboo was doing everything, playing quarterback, he was punting, he was whatever. They beat UCLA because Kenny went in and we're going to run basically swinging gate.
Yeah.
All this funky stuff that Dan Casey would spend hours probably like laughing about.
Yeah.
And it showed his ingenuity and creativity and like his effort, kind of quality. And it's good. And like, so they're in what you just asked me was they're in the Big 12 and there is no powerhouse there. There's no Ohio State there. There's no, Alabama there. It's just different. And it's the most up for grabs conference. You're in an area where you should be able to get a lot of players. We'll see if they like really ramp up facilities and everything. Because remember, it was a friggin' mess when Herm was there. It was like just total chaos of the stuff was going on. And they had still signed some good players.
They signed a ton of players. Yeah.
They've always had some players around there. It was just a incredible amount of dysfunction and can't get out of your own way. And now they have something they can build off of. And then the league there where, like, if you ask me, and there's other really good coaches. I mean, K-State's always going to be a problem as long as Kleiman is there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Matt Campbell's a really good coach at Iowa State. And it was around BYU, and Kalani kind of has that thing going. And we'll see what happens with Colorado in terms of staying power. And, TCU has resources and whatnot. And we know Texas Tech's spending a ton of money. But, like, there is nothing in that league that would be like, oh, like ASU is going to have a hard time competing with that because like nobody has history like that. So got a ton of momentum. I mean, shoot, they should have probably beat Texas in that game, right? So, I mean, I know Scadaboo's gone, but like Scadaboo, I feel like left behind a legacy in that like I always felt like towards the end of the year, that program was taking on his personality. Like you're seeing them go play all out, running their face into walls. I mean, just like that. I think that can stay. The quarterback's really talented. I think he's a guy who's like, if you told me 2 years from now that he's a top 10 pick, I'd be like, yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. So
in today's modern era, which direction are you going in terms of hiring? Because Kenny Dillingham, had been a coordinator at major places, an assistant at major places in Auburn and Florida State and Oregon. And it seems like the coaches, especially the younger coaches who are succeeding, have that major program experience as assistants and are not necessarily coming over from a G5 job or a power job to a power job with, you mentioned two of those guys, and Brian Kelly and Lincoln Riley struggling to find footing, going from major job to major job. Is there a specific direction you would go in that is more advantaged in this, in 2025?
I would lean towards the guy who was the established lower divisions coach who's kept on winning. Now, that's actually Brian Kelly, too.
That's true.
Because he was at Grand Valley State and he was at Central Michigan, and he's definitely a CEO. Lance Leipold is exactly that. Certainly, Kalen DeBoer is that. I would be more inclined to bet on that if I was in that position. I don't know how it's going to, it hasn't always worked. Like Paul Wolf was the guy before Leach at Washington State.
Right.
Was really successsul. It did not work there.
But Kurt Cignetti, right? In smaller schools, always won. Yeah.
Cignetti, right? Absolutely Cignetti. I mean, there's so many examples of guys like that. Whereas the ones which is like it's tough, and I think is the hot coordinator guy, like there really wasn't that guy in this cycle.
No.
The closest thing I could think of was Shannon Dawson, the OC at Miami. Like there was jobs that I was like, oh, I could see Shannon play for it. He went to college in North Carolina. There was a job at App State that I know they were interested in him. I don't think he was getting North Carolina, but like I could, he's a really good offensive coach. He's got presence to him, and I could see. But beyond that, if you looked at like just in the Final Four coordinators, Chip Kelly's 60 or 61, Al Golden's mid 50s, Jim Knowles is about 60, and who's the other one I'm thinking of? Oh, Mike Denbrock is around 60.
Sure.
Like, so, and those guys were all guys who had outstanding years. So it's not like there was a lot of, you had Will Stein at your alma mater. I think Will's done some really good stuff. There's certainly some young coaches who are like, yeah, keep an eye on that guy.
Glenn Schumann. Yeah.
It wasn't like the cycle of like 5 years ago where, oh, here comes Joe Brady as the passing coordinator at LSU on the national title. Or here comes, like, some of those guys got jobs.
Right.
And I think that's changed things a little. Or some of the coaches are so young. Like, I could see Danton Lynn as a head coach somewhere. Danton's still really young. But there's, like Kenny Dillingham, super young. He got a job where they were desperate, and it's a great fit, and he's crushing it. So good on the Arizona State people for giving him a shot.
Final question. You do a series. I don't know if it has a name, but it's really good, where you talk to a lot of coaches ahead of big games, either during the regular season or in the postseason. I'm just curious to know what that process is. Are you just spamming everybody you know who's played them? Have people solved riddles in the comments? I'm like, oh, that's that quote is this guy for sure. I mean, I try to do that when I read it, and I'm probably almost always wrong. How much is unprintable? So here's what I want. I want a behind the scenes on your behind the scenes series of talking to coaches.
Well, so the best one I did of those this year,
and tell people what it is more clearly than I just did.
Yeah, the best one of those for me was actually the one on Notre Dame going into the national title game.
Okay,
like, I had two strong groups of coaches who played both teams, Indiana guys, Penn State guys. But then there was other guys who I had who had played Notre Dame as well. They were really candid. I wasn't even sure I was going to do one of those. And then I have a coach who I talk to all the time who's a great quote, and he's very candid about stuff. And I didn't go in saying, hey, I'm doing this story. I just asked him, like, tell me about them. And because I know I have a podcast, or, two at the time, because I still do the Bear Bets one in season with Malika. And, there's other stuff so I wasn't planning on doing the story until I talked to this guy for an hour and 5 minutes. And then I got some amazing stuff that was just kind of like, okay, this is great insight. A lot of it I honestly couldn't use because it was too specific.
Okay.
Like, that's where you run into, like, the behind the scenes of it is like, oh, this is a dead giveaway who this is.
Right.
Because it's so specific. There's an example, like, this might not have been for this story, but, like, I remember I asked somebody, why did so-and-so ate you guys up? This was like the third receiver on their team. And I was like, how good is he? And he was like, thought about it. He was like, oh, wait. And then he was like, what happened was we had a third string cornerback in that game.
Right.
Like, it was like, that probably doesn't happen even if our backup's in, So it's like, yeah, the guy had like 4 catches for 113 yards, but like 70 of them came on a complete bust where the kid should be playing probably FCS football.
Right.
So I was like, okay, that's where the stats are kind of like, when you hear what happened, you kind of take it like better context. Right. And so those things are great for me because I just feel like I learned so much. And, it's just really interesting to go through it. Like, we did something during the national title game where I had a coach who's a head coach. And I said, we talked about this ahead of time. And I was like, do you want to be on the record or off the record? He was like, let's be off the record. That's okay. So during the game, like, I was like, give me your observations. And some of the stuff he had was great. It was just like, it was just very interesting to get, because they see the game way differently.
Yeah.
And, I don't care who it is, who, like, there's some really, good people to follow, whether it's on whatever social media, who either do all 22 stuff or whatever, but they didn't play against the team. They didn't coach against the team. They don't, they may know some stuff because they heard somebody, give a clinic talk. But then when you get some of this other perspective on things, I mean, I'll share this part. Like, I asked Chip Kelly about the orbit return play that Jeremiah Smith scores on in the national title game
that Alabama had run. Yeah.
Correct. And I was like, were you guys saving that? And he was like, well, and then you talk about it. He was like, well, we didn't want to run it against against Sark in Texas because the systems are fairly similar. And so you figure like,
Right.
oh, they're gonna be able to pick up on that easier, and it's just kind of interesting to get the actual background of why somebody did something. So I go into all this stuff, Dan. I was like, I want to learn stuff.
Right.
And the only tricky part is when the fingerprints are so easy to see where I'm like, I got to be careful. Like Stu once asked me, he was like, oh, that was so-and-so, right? And I was like, no, the reason why I thought that was because it was like a former, like I think I referenced that this was not for like in the last couple of months, but it was like, it's a former Pac-12 head coach. And so he's like, oh, that has to be Chip Kelly, or that has to be what I was like, like almost everybody, there was like 11 guys who are former Pac-12 head coaches now, right? Like he was like, Lincoln Riley is a former Pac-12 head coach. You go through the list, like Kenny Dillingham is a former Pac-12 head coach. Dan Lanning is. So I was like, it's just the way you identify somebody in a story, or I'd be like, yeah, they played him in the second half of the season. You just like, you're trying to be careful on not, and sometimes the readers do get it right, for sure.
Yeah.
But more times than not, they're just assuming, oh, it's this guy. And I'm like, that's not who it is or whatever. So.
What else is unprintable? Is there like an unbelievable amount of confidence that you're just like, I don't know if that's, I guess that's probably the most printable, right? If a coach saying like they're going to murder them, it would shock me if they don't murder them. Is there anything that's unprintable besides, being too obvious in terms of decoding?
The part that I get cautious of on, and this is like a good discussion point, is they're still college players. Yes, they are getting paid. Some of them are getting paid seven figures, but just how critical
being mean. Yeah.
You let somebody be. Yeah. And Ewers is a good example here. Like he's like, somebody was not shy about letting it float out that he was making seven figures at a really early age as a college player. But he's still a college player and he's still a teenager at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the comments of him, and I think what's delicate is this guy was, as you know, like the highest ranked quarterback recruit in the history of like 247 and Rivals and that whole, group.
Right.
He had a really good career. Now, if you told me like to be the highest 5-star ever, like who does that, like what kind of career do you have to have, right? You would expect him to be a top 10 pick at least, right? And that very rarely happens. Like Joe Burrow was like a low 4, high 3-star on the two services, and he, obviously exceeded. But it's usually like, it's tricky on that. So it's like people are like blunt about it, and coaches, especially when it comes to quarterbacks, will be very critical, and you want to. Like I remembered, not this past year, but in 2023, going into the Alabama-Michigan game, like I had a lot of really good stuff. And as you remember, I think, like a lot of people thought Alabama was going to win that game. And if you read my story, a lot of the coaches, and I remember one coach in particular, was like, it was almost like we were arguing. We weren't, but I was like this guy was flat wrong on how good Michigan was. And he didn't give them that much credit. And the Michigan fans were like, thought I was like Urban Meyer for putting that
right
out. Now, look, I'd written more about Michigan. I predicted Michigan to win the national title in the preseason and in the spring,
mm-hmm.
About it. But like that was, at least from the people I talked to, and it wasn't selective. Like, oh, let me find the people who think Alabama is going to maul Michigan. But like, that there's something that definitely goes into that, where you're sitting there going, okay, how does this read like in terms of that?
Right.
I wasn't shocked that Michigan would beat Alabama. It was like, and it didn't feel like it was that fluky, but at the same time, I think a lot of people looked at them, they had beaten Georgia, and, like Michigan stubbed their toe the year before against TCU. They didn't look very good against Georgia 2 years earlier. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michigan was one of those schools where it's like they would win, and they certainly have talent, especially on defense. And JJ McCarthy's more talented than I think a lot of college media wanted to give him credit for at the time. But some of the things they're really good at, they get glossed over. Really, really physical, really good offensive line. Those are hard things to like kind of, it's different if you have Justin Jefferson or CJ Stroud or like really shiny objects, right?
No, and a coach gives you a quote of Jalen Milroe is an edge rusher playing quarterback. You're just like, thank you very much. We have a pull quote. We have a headline. Thank you so much for your help.
Oh man, I got like one of the guys, this is like, I have some great stuff in my head about one of these coaches, about like a couple of guys, and it's like, it's rough, but it's like, you can tell it's coaches who really would love to have a couple of these guys on their team. It's like a coach who used to work for one of these schools and knows what some of these guys are like. And I was like, okay, these are guys I can talk about in context, but I can never use some of this stuff because it's just it's identifiable.
Yeah, it's more fun almost in reading those pieces where there's a coach who's just so effusive that they're just like, oh, number 52 is something else. Like that kind of guy never comes around. That's the cool stuff because you just assume coaches are going to be jaded and be like, yeah, he's fine, or that's a guy. Like, yes, they're better there. But when a coach is like, yeah, number 81 is a problem that nobody's going to be able to solve, I kind of like that kind of honesty to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some of those where it's like JJ Smith was the guy that like I would tell Stu all season, because we went to Ohio State like 7 times. If you have to see him in person, you don't realize how big he is.
Right.
Like ultimate's 215. Chip was like, yeah, he's like 228. He's like a huge man who can really run, who's really skilled and everything else. And it's like, I think some of those things is like, I have the advantage of being at the games and seeing people up close. You can kind of see things, and it gives you just a different perspective on, like, my kid is really into Madden and everything. And we were talking about Penei Sewell. And I was like, oh, let me show you something. Because like we did a game, you'd probably remember this. This was when I was doing sideline, where it was one of the it might be the only time I've ever interviewed an offensive lineman after the game. So first of all, still a head coach. I'm like, yeah, this is me. This is another guy who's like 260 pounds, who's the head coach. And this is this like huge landmass of an individual.
Right.
You just, to see him move like that, it's not normal. It's just not, it's like Vita Vea. Vita Vea was like the only guy who almost got me to curse on camera, just because I was like, this is ridiculous how big and ferocious this guy is. He's just throwing 300-pound people around like they're ottomans.
I remember, so our friend Jeff Schwartz got a text from Mario Cristobal about Penei Sewell in fall camp, and it was cut-ups of Penei in one-on-ones or Oklahoma drill or something like that. And the quote was, this is true freshman Penei Sewell, was Mario Cristobal was like, day 1 left tackle, day 1 draft pick. Before he had played a game, you're just like, this is a complete unicorn. You don't see this ever. And Penei Sewell is on a clear path. Like, he's already ready to be an All-American left tackle. He only played 2 years in college, but I just remember seeing that and hearing that and saw some of the cut-ups. I was like, oh, okay, this is different. We have a situation.
People can say they want about Mario as a coach. Mario has a really good eye for talent, and he has especially a good eye for linemen. I can think of so many examples of guys that, I want to say maybe Deron Payne, who was at Alabama early as a young player, maybe when he was even a recruit before he left. But there was guys where he could see it. Now look, I mean, he saw more like ridiculous talent at Miami as a player than probably anybody. So I think that probably shaped it. And then he was at Alabama, but he definitely knows what it looks like at that level. And so I just remember that particular guy. And then also it's like, okay, now Thibodeau has to go up against him every day in practice. What does that look like?
Right. No, all makes sense. Bruce Feldman, taking up way too much of your time. Fox Sports, The Athletic, Bear Bets, The Audible. Anywhere where there's college football, Bruce is somewhere. So, Bruce, thank you very much for your time, and I owe you a lot of croutons, I guess. Next time are you in Chicago at all in the next year or so?
Hopefully. I mean, honestly, like I'm one who loves deep dish pizza, and you're the only. I'm not shitting you. You're
Okay.
the only one who's like competitive with that.
Oh, I am. And I actually I know a Malnati at this point. So I don't know what that actually means, but I'm not intimidated is what I'm saying. I'm ready to roll.
You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Like, I just can't get over. You should basically put up a shingle and open up don't laugh. I think you would probably.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. I'll say this. Anybody who I am friends with in college football, if you're listening to this, come by. I will make you pizza. I don't want to deal with the public at all. I don't know if you've ever worked in a restaurant. I have. The public is terrible to work with food. But I like cooking for friends and family, and so you get included in that.
I'm grateful.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
You got it.